On a quiet summer weekend in 1995, far from the cameras that had followed him since the day he saluted his father's coffin, John F. Kennedy Jr. stepped onto a boat off Martha's Vineyard with a question that had nothing to do with politics, legacy, or the weight of a name that had defined American royalty for decades. It was a moment he had tried to make simple, almost ordinary, even though nothing in his life had ever truly been that. The ocean stretched around them, the noise of Manhattan replaced by wind and water, and beside him stood Carolyn Bessette, the woman who had disrupted the carefully constructed rhythm of his public world. He didn't ask her in the way people expected. There was no theatrical speech, no grand performance designed for headlines. Instead, he turned to her with a line that sounded more like a private promise than a proposal, something about how fishing is always better with a partner and whether she would be his. It was intimate, slightly awkward, deeply sincere, the kind of question that comes from someone who had spent his entire life being watched and wanted, for once, to be understood without an audience. But Carolyn did not say yes. Not immediately, and that hesitation would become one of the most revealing chapters in their love story, because it exposed the truth that their relationship was never just a romance. It was a negotiation between two completely different worlds, one built on anonymity, independence, and control, and the other on myth, expectation, and a spotlight that never turned off. She didn't refuse him in anger. She didn't reject the idea of a future. She simply said she would think about it. And in that pause lived every fear she had about what marrying John F. Kennedy Jr. would mean. It meant losing privacy. It meant becoming a symbol. It meant being photographed walking down the street, being analyzed for what she wore, how she smiled, whether she looked happy enough. It meant stepping into a life where even joy would be public property. For him, the delay only made the feeling stronger. People who knew him said that those 3 weeks of uncertainty didn't push him away, they pulled him closer. He had grown up in a family where history moved quickly, where tragedy and triumph arrived without warning, and where love was often tangled with responsibility. Carolyn's hesitation wasn't rejection, it was real. And real was something he wanted. When she finally said yes, it was not the triumphant ending of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a secret. They chose to hide their engagement from the world, not because they were unsure, but because they wanted to hold on to something that belonged only to them. At that time their relationship had not yet been fully consumed by the media. They could still walk into a restaurant and be just another couple. They could still argue without it becoming a headline. They could still exist in the fragile space between public fascination and private life. The ring he gave her carried its own quiet symbolism. In the television version of their story, it appears as the legendary ring of his mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, a perfect visual metaphor for inheritance and destiny. But in reality, he chose something more personal, a reinterpretation of a ring Jackie wore when she wasn't wearing her famous one. It was a gesture that said this wasn't about recreating the past. It was about building something new, even while the past hovered over everything. And then the world found out. Not through an announcement, not through a carefully staged photograph, but through a zoomed-in image of her hand published in a tabloid. A single frame that transformed a private promise into public property. Suddenly the question was no longer whether they were engaged, it was why they were hiding it. He denied it. Standing in front of reporters to promote his magazine, he allowed a statement to be read saying the engagement rumors were untrue. It was a strategic decision, a professional calculation, the kind of move required in a life where timing and image were always part of the equation. But for Carolyn, it was something else. It was the first clear glimpse of what marriage to him would demand, that sometimes their reality would have to bend to the needs of his public world. It hurt her, not because she doubted his love, but because she understood the cost of it. This was the central tension of their relationship. He had spent his life learning how to live inside the spotlight, and she had spent hers avoiding it. He was born into mythology, she had created herself from nothing. He belonged to a country, she belonged to herself. And yet, when they were together, friends described them as deeply connected, playful, almost ordinary in the way they cooked dinner, walked their dog, argued about small things, and laughed in ways the cameras never captured. Their wedding would reflect that same need for control. A secret ceremony on a remote island. No press, no spectacle, only a handful of people who knew how much it meant to them to keep one moment untouched by the machinery of fame. But even in secrecy, the myth followed. Because this was never just the story of a proposal. It was the story of a woman deciding whether she could live inside a legend without disappearing into it, and a man trying to prove that behind the most famous last name in America was someone capable of choosing love in the simplest, most human way. Her hesitation was not doubt about him. It was clarity about the world he came from. And his persistence was not about winning. It was about waiting until she believed that their relationship could exist not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a partnership. That is why their engagement still fascinates people decades later. Not because of the rings, the secrecy, or the political dynasty, but because it revealed something rare, two people trying to protect something real while the entire world watched. In the end, the question was never whether Carolyn resisted the proposal. The real question was whether love could survive the weight of history. For a time, it did.